positive effect on global trade because it adds a new dimension to the global trading system. Currently, the main trade routes that exist in the world center around the USA. So we trade through the Atlantic and we trade through the Pacific to Europe, to Asia. However, this creates a new set of trade routes that don't center around the US, that link countries that were previously not plugged into the global economy. This is important, particularly at a time when the US is literally pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We think it's good when other countries like China take the mantle to preserve free trade. Why is free trade important? We think it's good because of the law of comparative advantage. And I know that's a very complex term. So simply put, it means that it's better when countries can produce goods that they are efficient at producing. Through free trade, they can obtain goods through trade that they are not efficient at producing, while domestically only producing goods that they are good at producing. Even if some jobs are lost, and we do sympathize with jobs are lost through free trade, we think it's generally a good thing when goods and services flow through the entire world, because that means people in Central Asia can now get TVs, clothes made in Europe, for example, toys made in China, food grown elsewhere around the world, and we think that benefits them. At the end of the day, we understand that the Belt and Road Initiative builds a route towards progress. We are very proud to oppose.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, the road to economic development is a difficult one. It's one that takes time. It's one that requires your economy to be stable. It's one that requires things like corruption to be got rid of. It's one that requires things like democratization, so that your markets can actually be free. That's why, when you look at countries like Eastern Europe, 40 years ago, countries like Croatia, you saw that they were in similar economic conditions. Yet, the IMF imposed those stringent conditions on them, and they're now prosperous countries. That's because we recognise that this process has to take time, and even if that road is a more difficult one, it is one that these countries have to take. Opposition supports a side that pretends a magical pill exists, where you can bypass that road and take it in 5 years. Problematically, that pill does not actually exist, and it's only in the interests of China and leads these countries into economic instability and leads them into downturn and into recession. We think the world we provide might be a little bit harder. Maybe you get a little bit less loans at the moment, but it's one that actually leads to long-term economic growth. I'm going to be looking at 3 questions, basically. Firstly, which side helps developing countries? Secondly, which sides improve democracies inside these countries? And finally, on which side does China's influence and expansion grow? On this first part, I'd just like to note the numerous lines of analysis from Office of Jill that just went unresponded. We told you things about the fact they have an incentive to give loans to to countries that they know will not be able to repay them, so they can literally do things such as in their debt restructuring programs, they can do things such as get the rights to things such as putting in Chinese workers in all your buildings, to having Chinese contractors being the ones who export oil. That's important because when they tell you, oh, you know, local people will gain loads of jobs and that's a road to democratization, countries like Thailand have literally had protests in the streets because they realized that local people were not getting the jobs that opposition tells you are, because they were all being held out to Chinese contractors. Thirdly, we told you the projects China allows to succeed are ones that China wants to succeed. So we tell you that the roads that go from a Chinese-owned Angolan mine to a Chinese-owned port are probably the ones that do well. It's not the Colombian 4 billion dam that literally was built in an area that locals protested against because they knew that it was prone to flooding. 2 years later, after China built that dam in Colombia, a landslide destroyed it, and 26,000 people had to be evacuated. That's because realistically, that dam doesn't actually help China, and because they don't care for that project. That's why they don't spend money on making sure that these things are successful. But what do they tell you? They told us that China has an incentive to make sure these projects succeed. I just don't believe this is true, because if you think about it, prospering developing nations that are going to compete with China, undercut their markets, steal their share of global trade, is not something in China's interest. Why would you want whole of Africa being able to compete in a market that you already dominate. So there's literally no reason for that. The real reason they do this is because they know that when they could do things such as giving loans to bad countries, they can exploit their natural resources. They can do things such as the Chinese palm oil companies in Malaysia, which have cut down 80% of the rainforest on the island of Borneo. That's because they know that's what helps them. They don't really care about the long-term prosperity of these countries. They care about exploiting them for every single last penny they can get and then leaving as quickly as possible, because realistically they don't care. And actually it's in their interest. What is the comparative we told you? We told you that the IMF doesn't want to steal your land. The IMF wants to have developing economies so that it can trade with them, because it doesn't have the same perverse and awful laws. That's because they often come from democratic nations, places like Japan, places like America, places like the Europe. So they are held by their people in the knowledge their country cannot go in and invade these countries and exploit them for all these resources. Even if we accept that there might be less loans, we think actually these loans are often cheaper, but far, far better for these countries. We think that is so much. We think that's incredibly important under our side. Second point of clash then, before we move on.
You say that it's good when countries take out IMF loans because then they liberalize. Please deal with our analysis that the IMF loans don't exist on your side, so it's comparatively better when they develop and therefore liberalize.
Do exist under our side. Like the IMF does just give out thousands of loans already. But what we say is the reason IMF loans aren't being taken up at the moment is because countries go to as my partner told you, feel like they can just go to China in this false promise that they will get to that short term with the less restrictions. Where if China didn't have the One Belt Road policy, they would be going to the IMF in a far, far better way. That's the comparative in this debate. Secondly, which side improves the democratic conditions in the country? So first of all, I'd just like to note, all their analysis relied on actually proving economic benefits of empowering local people. And when they tell you when people have economic growth, they can do things such as improving economic conditions. I'd also just like to note that this just isn't really true. I mean, if you look at the country we're talking about, China, a country that's seen the most economic growth in the past couple of decades, that is still one of the most illiberal regimes, which still does things such as executes people. It still represses people in Tibet. It still has mock trials of people and represses democracy. It's just not true that the biggest example of economic growth actually leads to the democratization they want to tell you to us. And that's where exit material becomes so important in this debate. In that China is willing to prop up illiberal regimes and ignore them. It's willing to support things such as paying off corrupt officials with £10 million loans so that they can get those access to those ports, so that they can get into contractors. Because they don't really care about leading these countries to democratization because of the inherent nature. In fact, it's often an incentive to use the corruption that exists and support those very networks and do things such as supporting white elephant projects that allow it to get those exclusive rights to those things. No, thank you. We think that's even worse. Finally, on which side of this debate do we think the expansion of China's global influence is better? We told you that actually China's global influence is hugely improved under this side. And that's why, in 2016, Papua New Guinea, for the first ever time, officially recognized China's legitimacy in the South China Sea. Weirdly enough, a year after it got some of the biggest loans from China ever, and also wasn't able to repay the interest. I wonder where that comes from. But the point here is, do you think China is more likely to invade the South China Sea when most of Oceania supports its legitimacy in that area, or when most of South China Sea doesn't? I think that's a clear comparative that's far more likely. But their response is, this is a high-risk strategy for China, so why would they do it? First of all, just noting that it's a high-risk strategy is why it's incredibly unlikely that China will invade any of these countries. We think, if you just think about it, China invading most of Africa is just not going to happen. But if it does, the times when it happens is when it literally gets to station its destroyers in your own ports. Because weirdly enough, you don't own them anymore, and you can't even tax them because all the things that go through them are awful. The second response here was that, Trump is presumably worse than China. I first of all note that Trump is the only actor we're talking about under their side, but also, we have structural reasons as to why we think Western nations like this better. Firstly, they have a democratic enforcement, which I've already mentioned, means they're far less likely to do things such as prop up dictators. Also, I think in general, most people believe that European nations are probably probably far more moral than China is, given all the things that I'm telling you about. But secondly, when we're talking about multilateral aid, they do not have the incentive. But one country in the IMF cannot claim a port and land because it's not one country. That only exists when you have a sole provider of China. So the IMF literally could not do that because it's made up of loads of countries. Look, at the end of this debate, Prop wanted to claim loads of benefits. But realistically, you have to realise that China is not looking out for the development of developing countries, because that doesn't actually help it. It doesn't actually help to have competitors pushing down its price and stealing its market share. What it cares about is stealing resources. What it cares about is building those mines with Chinese workers and not local workers. At that point, any of their benefits fall out of this baby to the
I would like to take the third speaker of the proposition for their speech and would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Proposition states that liberalization is important because it guarantees human rights. Members of the House, this is a lie that Western countries have sold to us for decades. And after decades, it's very clear that there are still multiple countries that are clearly illiberal. And the reason why that's the case is because it refuses to acknowledge that the only way to ensure human rights is when people get money. Because only when they have money and are educated can they really care about other issues that their side wants to talk about. So don't let them continue on with this lie that liberalization is a champion of human rights, because it has failed and it will continue to fail. I will ask two questions in today's debate. The first on economic development and the second on political issues. Let's just talk about economic development. The main claim that I told you very clearly is very simply that their side will not have any aid at all. We gave you structural observations why this is the case. Things like, for example, how Western countries have no money now, or the fact that they are politically unstable. So when they say that Xi Jinping will stay in power for the next 10 years, I think that's a good thing, as opposed to individuals like Angela Merkel, for example, who might get elected out next year. Nick, you're only about to questions, so to give us examples of when the IMF gave cash and tell us that it happened 11,000 times. Let's just note that if that was truly the case, then no one would choose a BRI on outside of the house. The reason why they chose a BRI is because for these countries, China was the only country that wanted to provide them with loans. Their next response to this was to tell us that it's okay because the reason why they don't get money is because they refuse to liberalize or follow other conditions like having women in the workforce, for example.
Question.
Well, I think I acknowledge that it sounds good, for example, there's such conditionalities. But insofar as countries cannot fulfill them, then I think that having these conditionalities basically mean that countries on their side will have no money at all. So I think that this is something that their side concedes. We also noted how their argument on how we are funding illiberal dictators or trying to harm human rights is not true. A, we do this for hypocrisy because the US asked it as well. So this is a non-argument. Second, the question that both sides need to answer in this debate is a comparative. Which side best allow for human rights to exist? Is it on their side where they continue to refuse giving them aid, so there will be no change on their side, or on our side where when individuals get more educated, where when civil servants get more money so they don't need to be corrupt, are we really able to break out of corruption? So on this comparative alone, even on their grounds, we win this point as well. Let's just note on the comparative therefore is that they have no money on their side and money on our side. And again, this was a comparative that their first speaker has considered when they say that countries that don't accept these conditionalities deserve it. What does it mean when they say that these countries deserve it? Let's be very clear what we told you from first speaker. This means, for example, no energy and roads. And unfortunately, these are things that actually relate to people's human rights. When factories cannot operate, when individuals need to walk 20 kilometers just to get to the nearest hospital. All of these are harms that they are concede to. We told you about how this also includes global trade and infrastructure. Their only response was that all of these are headline projects or that they will just build roads to nowhere that won't benefit China. A few observations to make here. First of all, if these roads lead to nowhere or they are really useless, countries won't agree to it either. I'm not sure why countries that accept the BRI on our side are so dumb, like clearly it doesn't make sense. But second, trade benefits both sides as well. They want to claim that trade will only benefit China and that the trade routes will only go towards China. Again, a few observations to make. Airports clearly fly to every country on earth, not just China. Trading ports, again, lead to every country. That's why Kazakhstan, the oil exporting country, for example, with the BRI, was able to build a new port in Baku and ensure that its shipping routes doesn't need to just go through Russia. So they're now able to export their oil to more countries. So I think one key observation to make is that global trade enables BRI countries to trade with everyone, not just China. Even if you're said that only China, that countries only trade with China, that's a good thing. Because when countries trade, it's not exploitation where resources get out of your country. You get money back in return as well. Money and development are things that are important for people as well. So even if you concede that there's only trade with China, no thank you, there's a more realistic comparison of outside the house, that's good. Because when countries trade with China, they get money and development. That's also similar to how many countries are only relying on the United States for trade, for example. Not sure why this is a huge harm at all. But before I move on, sure.
Given that Ed gave you structural reasons why the investment in countries goes to the leaders and not to the people of those countries, why doesn't that help prop up repressive regimes as opposed to lead to education and liberalism?
First of all, if the money only goes to corrupt governments, people on the ground will be unhappy, in which case your policy will fail. Second, we do very clearly that we are willing to accept the trade-off, that perhaps some corruption will occur. But the point is that more individuals get more money, then are we really finally able to break away from corruption as a whole. Let's just move on to the other catchphrases they claim of structural reasons and deal with them as well. The first claim they made was that China knows that these countries will fail. That's why they gave the loans. Well, then I think that if that's the case, countries will sign and agree onto a BRI. That's why I see observations in Malaysia, for example, in Thailand that they wanted to talk about, when protests on the streets and government awareness meant they didn't want to restructure deals with China over the BRI. These are all good things on outside the house, because we recognize that BRI is about the future of the BRI as well. And the future of the BRI, apart from one bad example of Haman Quota, does look good. Even though they are shining bright example of Haman Quota, we know that China operates these ports. However, the profits clearly still go to Sri Lanka. That's one. Second, when you trade with Sri Lanka benefits as well. Workers on the ground are hired. The next structural reason tells us that China doesn't hire these workers. Well, they do, because clearly it's very expensive to just ship many Chinese workers over to the African continent. But further, I think what's more realistic, as we told you from first speaker, is that there are Chinese subcontractors that are present as well, who hire Chinese local workers. It looks like, for example, the 14,000-kilometer long coastal railway in Nigeria, for example, where they hire over 20,000 local workers with Chinese subcontractors as we have been. So perhaps, so this is crucial, we have been that there will be Chinese workers on our side, but there will also be local workers on our side of the house. But crucially, the presence of Chinese workers and Chinese economies means that there's a structural incentive for them to ensure that these businesses and developments don't go bankrupt as well. If your roads and bridges, if your shipping ports collapse, for example, that means that countries like China cannot trade with these countries anymore. So there's no incentive for them to build falling bridges and destroy ports altogether. But before I move on, sure.
Because Chinese companies aren't bound by the same conditions as international ones are, why are they not more likely to do things like exploit the environment exactly as they did with 80% of the Malaysian Borneo rainforest?
Well, first of all, I told you that these things are already being restructured, so that this pushback, I don't think that countries that see the BRI are completely have no ability to trade at all. Surely they are able to renegotiate deals as well. Given structural reasons why there's pushback right now, your side needs to acknowledge this. Let's then move on to the last idea about their IMF loan conditionalities being very nice. Let's just note that Indonesia in 1997, the structural assistance plan that Indonesia got actually harmed the country. So in terms of Croatia, for example, I think for vast majority of circumstances, that's just not true. But even as a comparative, we know that our side is better, because unlike the IMF, as a global body that has no incentive to care about the success of the countries, on our side, China has an incentive to ensure that these countries benefit as well. Let's then move on to the last idea of politics. The main argument in first speaker was that countries that try to just buy votes from the global economy in order to win over votes in the United Nations. Let's just know that all countries do this as well. I think your countries next to the United States or depend on the US for trade, like for example the French Polynesian Islands, you equally will vote for the United States as well to fail. So I think that this argument makes no sense on their side of the house. What is more important, however, is our argument on Chinese aggression. This takes them on their best case scenario, because we acknowledge that even if we accept all their ideas about how China is evil, for example, the question is how do they become more evil? On our side, all they can do is to have signed trade deals, for example, so that they get some benefits on trade. On their side, they get completely harmed at all. At the end of the day, I just recognize that their side never dealt with any of our arguments to show why structurally China has an incentive to improve. At the end of the day, we recognize that the Belt and Road Initiative builds a route towards progress we oppose.
I would like to thank the third speaker of the opposition for their speech, and I now invite the reply speaker of side opposition.
Proposition talks a lot about democracy, but if they listen carefully, from first speaker we had two responses. First, we told you, we like democracy because it protects choice. What truly takes away choice is when people on the ground don't have money and don't have jobs. Second, and this is important, you know when people care about democracy, you know when people care about the environment, you know when people care about fighting corruption, when they already have jobs and their basic needs are fulfilled. So they push a lot about democracy, but they never actually tell us how they achieve all of these good outcomes. And it's far too late if Top Reply wants to come up and be the first speaker on the other side to actually show us the link. So I want to talk about the two worlds that emerge at the end of this debate and tell you how the world of proposition harmed these countries. Note that every single one of the benefits, the environment, fighting corruption, liberalization, every single one of the benefits stand on the idea of accepting IMF loans. In that regard, it's a bad strategic move that they never actually deal with the reasons why we tell you that they won't accept IMF loans. A, because there are simply not enough of these IMF loans. Literally, we give you so many structural reasons. A lack of political stability in the West, the fact that the West has no money, the fact that the West is becoming increasingly insular, or no response that show you why the IMF loans won't exist that they stand for. In that case, all of the liberalization and environmental regulations won't exist. We told you, more importantly, even if these loans exist, countries won't get them. Like, I don't get it. If the government is really so corrupt and determined to preserve its corrupt nature, then they just won't accept the IMF loans and won't reform. So again, as we told you right from first, all of their benefits won't occur because even if IMF loans exist, countries won't accept them. Again, it's far too late if Top Reply is the first to respond to all of these structural reasons. More importantly, we told you, even in their best case of the case, where they do accept IMF loans and IMF loans exist, we told you how their work penalizes countries. We think sometimes the liberal arrogance of the West is what causes countries to end up doing bad things. We literally, from first speaker, mind you, give you an example of the Latin American debt crisis, when IMF structural adjustment programs mired people in decades of debt. They talked a lot about debt because it's factually untrue that the West causes debt. I can easily say it's factually untrue that the IMF loans are good. More importantly, we told you in their work, many of the harms are symmetric. The idea of propping up the liberal governments, we push them, they did not respond to their own argument. The idea of how you, literally, the US props up corrupt governments, like Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, literally, again, no response on their side. So to be clear, at the end of this debate, they have not told us why it is okay to wait. Why it is okay to wait when people live without electricity, when they live without jobs, when they live without roads, when they live without highways, when they live without money. We told you that it's far too late if Top Reply wants to be the first speaker to tell us why it's okay to wait. What then is the world of opposition? We give you structural incentives of China, and again, note that this was not actually dealt with on team proposition. From first, we told you, if China really wants to achieve the status of an economic hegemon, it won't want to be the big brother of a failing, indebted region. It has an incentive to ensure that the region is lording over, is prosperous and flourishing. And mind you, the US has the same incentive not to have Africa compete with it. So their new response in first speaker doesn't really stand because the US probably also doesn't want Africa to compete with it, particularly when Trump runs on the platform of America first. Literally, we told you, our side is the side that ensures that countries get the money they need for development. In our world, that is when countries are able to get money that allows them to build jobs. And we give you, again, structural reasons why it won't just be trophy cabinet projects, why it won't just be highways that go from one Chinese mine to another, why there is an incentive for China to ensure that global trade flourishes. My second speaker's argument, which mind you, they didn't actually properly respond to, on how we ensure we preserve free trade, that means that people in Central Europe get clothes, get food, get jobs, get products that all of us take for granted, but many of them don't have. We think the most pernicious line in that case is that some countries don't deserve development, that some countries don't deserve to get aid because they are bad and illiberal. We think that punishes people on the ground, and what we do is ensure that people on the ground get the money they deserve. We understand on our side that the Belt and Road Initiative builds a road towards progress we are very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the reply speaker of the opposition and would like to invite the reply speaker of the position.
side opposition can't win this debate because they did not have this debate. They did not accept the factual realities of the Belt and Road Initiative as it plays out in real life. The existence of it crowds out the billions and billions of dollars of funding in loans available from other international organisations. That the overwhelming majority of projects, in the words of their first speaker, exist to enhance Chinese influence and not to provide benefits for local people. That the overwhelming majority of projects in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, in North, South and Sub-Saharan Africa are not provided for by local people, but are constructed by Chinese workers flown in their millions. It's because they did not rebut or engage with the realistic characterization of what this policy looks like. The headlines that every member of this audience has seen over the last 6 months, that they can't win. 2 questions, conveniently engaging with their third speaker's points of clash: economics and politics. On economics, we told you Chinese loans are awful. The first thing we said was that they amount to loan shopping, a predatory practice whereby they give you a loan and you have to pay them interest. They build a project for you with their own workers or subcontractors, if the third speaker would prefer to call them that. And then when you can't pay back that loan, because they've given you way too much money than you can actually afford, they now own the road, and by the way, they're going to tax you to use it. The only response they had to this was, in their third speech by the way, was to say, if this is the case, why do these countries pursue this policy? That ignored all of the sophisticated analysis we brought you in first and second about how Uganda, Pakistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are not known for their high rates of democratization. In fact, these decisions are taken by executives that are not accountable to the people and who make them anyway. But even if that weren't true, the trophy cabinet nature of these projects, building big, sexy bridges rather than building schools, than building hospitals, than investing in humanitarian crises, that distracts people. But perhaps most problematically for them, we also told you about foreign workers. We also told you about only 30% of these projects actually completing because those are the ones that are in Chinese interests. The railway goes through Uzbekistan that locals are taxed to use and therefore priced out of. The only thing they had in response to this was to say, we bring economic benefits to local people. And I'm not kidding. This analysis reached peak sophistication when they said airports enable people to fly anywhere in the world, ignoring the fact that 90% of the flights will be to China and the cost of the tickets available at these airports will be elevated because China will tax locals to use them. But they realised they were losing this issue and tried to make the debate about something it just wasn't, whether this was a choice between no loans or Chinese loans. And they did this all down their bench. First, we said this is factually untrue. The EU gives 140 billion a year, the US 100 billion a year. In 2 years into the Trump administration, the IMF gives thousands of loans. They accused us of throwing numbers out because they were just lying to you, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing they said is, if this is true, people wouldn't use the Belt and Road Initiative. But we told you, one, the very presence of the BRI and the fact that it has such predatorily low interest rates crowds out other opportunities. No response to that. But perhaps most importantly, we tell you some of the least democratic, most repressive nations in the world are siding with this because they don't ask the probing questions. That was what you brought me in second, and they never engage with on a sophisticated level. They don't ask about your human rights violations. But second of all, on the politics of this debate, we told you in two separate ways how this entrenches dictators. Because it gives them money and allows them to hide and cloak domestic issues through superficial infrastructure projects. The only and most sophisticated response to this was to say China wants to distance itself from corruption. Yeah, Xi Jinping, the now president for life, has no quibbles around distancing himself from corruption. But we also brought you argumentation to suggest that this exacerbates Chinese influence in the world. They wanted to call this an argument about free trade. But it's not free trade if China owns all of your ports, all of your airports, all of your railways. Lastly, they throw out an argument about, by the way, that they don't revive in the third or reply, about military exacerbation. We tell you military exacerbation is so much more likely when these investments are used as a pretext for 21st century colonization of other countries. Very proud to report.